Ford built an engine that was supposed to save them. It didn't just save them. It became a legend. It tore through the market. It won NASCAR's biggest prize, not once, but twice in a row. Nobody could catch it. Nobody could stop it. But while it was out there winning, something else was happening. Something nobody could see. Something Ford's own engineers had already done to it, months before the first one ever left the factory. A narrow passage buried inside the engine's oiling system. And it was already working against the engine from the inside, one drive at a time. That engine was the Ford Y-Block V8. Right now, somewhere, one of these engines is still turning over, still running, and it's still carrying that same narrow passage inside it. And by the time anyone figured out what was happening, it was already too late to save it. Here's the question that should bother you. If this engine was strong enough to beat every rival in America, what could possibly be small enough to kill it? To answer that, go back to a moment Ford would rather forget. By 1952, Ford was falling behind in one place that mattered enormously: V8 technology. Cadillac had already rolled out a modern overhead valve V8, and buyers noticed immediately. Oldsmobile had one too, and its rocket engine was quickly becoming a household name, the kind of engine people specifically asked for by name at the dealership. Meanwhile, Ford was still selling the same flathead V8 it had been building for 20 years, an engine whose valves sat flat inside the block instead of up in the head, a layout that had already gone as far as its own design would ever let it go. It couldn't breathe the way the new overhead valve engines could. It couldn't make real power without a fight. And every year Ford held on to it, the gap between Ford and the rest of Detroit grew wider. Showroom by showroom, sale by sale, Ford's edge was disappearing. And somewhere inside Chevrolet's engineering department, something worse was coming. A new small block V8, lighter, tighter, built from the start with room to grow far beyond what its first version could do. If Ford didn't answer, and answer fast, this wasn't going to be a bad sales year. It was going to be the beginning of losing everything Ford had spent decades building its name on. Inside Ford's own boardrooms, the mood had turned grim. Executives were staring at sales charts that used to point one direction, up, and now refused to move at all. Every quarter, another dealer would call in with the same complaint. Customers were walking Ford lots, looking at the engine bay, and walking straight over to a Chevrolet dealership instead. This wasn't a rumor anymore. It was becoming a pattern nobody could explain away. So Ford's leadership gave one order, and it wasn't a suggestion. Get it done. Now. Engineers went to work on Ford's first real overhead valve V8, and they built it with a deep-skirted block, a design that wrapped the crankshaft in thick, reinforced iron like armor plating. It made the bottom end of this engine incredibly rigid, strong enough to survive whatever punishment Ford planned to throw at it later. From the front, that skirting made the block resemble the letter Y. The name stuck before the engine even had a release date. But there was one part of this new design nobody at Ford had ever had to solve before. How to get oil up into the valve train, into a part of the engine that had never existed on any Ford car until now. The flathead never needed this. Its valves lived down in the block. This was uncharted territory being figured out under a deadline nobody could move. Every engine needs oil pumped into places most drivers never think about. Not just the bottom, where the crankshaft spins, but the top, too, where valves slam open and shut thousands of times a minute, metal grinding against metal, with almost nothing between them but a film of oil thinner than paper. Take that oil away, even for a while, and those parts don't just wear down. They can fuse together from heat and friction, welding themselves into scrap, metal bonding to metal in a way that can never be undone. An engine can be dying up there while it sounds completely healthy everywhere else, and the driver behind the wheel has no way of knowing. Engineers ran a single oil passage from the center camshaft bearing up through the block into the cylinder head, feeding the rocker shafts that controlled every valve in the engine. And here's where it gets dark. The oil had to travel through a narrow, offset path before it ever reached the rocker shafts. The system could work perfectly when everything was clean and within specification, but it left very little room for error. The trouble started when sludge, wear, or a manufacturing tolerance narrowed that already limited flow even further. And that passage wasn't the only weak link waiting to cause trouble. Cam bearing wear could choke it further over time. A rocker shaft installed slightly wrong at the factory could starve one side of the engine before the other. This wasn't a single flaw sitting alone. It was a narrow margin for error, built into an engine that would spend the next decade being driven by people who had no idea that margin even existed. Whether Ford's engineers fully grasped how serious this weakness could become is hard to prove today. What we can see clearly is the consequence, built directly into the engine's oiling path, waiting for the wrong combination of conditions to expose it. But Chevrolet's small block was coming. The deadline wasn't moving. And a failure that might not show up for years in an engine that hadn't even been built yet wasn't going to stop a launch Ford could not afford to delay a second time. So they let it go through, not necessarily with any intention to cause harm. More likely, buried under a deadline, nobody in that room had the authority to move. No surviving Ford memo spells out that exact conversation word for word. But the outcome speaks for itself. An engine rushed to market with a narrow margin for error built into the one system it could least afford to compromise. In 1954, a full year ahead of Chevrolet, the Y block hit the market. And it didn't just sell, it exploded. At 239 cubic inches, the first version made 130 horsepower, a real jump over the flathead it replaced. But the number wasn't the headline. The headline was that for the first time in years, Ford wasn't playing catch-up anymore. None of the drivers lining up at Ford dealerships that year knew what they were really buying. A legend, yes, and something else, quietly, riding along inside it. By 1955, the Y block was under the hood of the brand-new Ford Thunderbird, an engine and a car built for each other. By 1956, displacement had climbed to 312 cubic inches, and Ford entered NASCAR with DePaulo Engineering behind the wheel. The result was almost unthinkable for a company that had just spent 2 years catching up to its rivals. Back-to-back manufacturers' championships, 1956 and 1957. Records set on the sand at Daytona. Records set in the thin mountain air at Pikes Peak, where the same engine that powered family sedans was hauling cars up a 2-mile climb faster than anything else in its class. Picture Daytona Beach early 1957. Hard-packed sand stretching to the horizon. Salt air thick enough to taste. A supercharged Ford sits at the line, tires sinking slightly into the wet sand, that blower whining high and mean under the hood like something barely under control. The flag drops. The car doesn't move so much as explode forward. Sand rips up behind the tires in a wall. The ocean blurs past on one side, and somewhere under that hood, inside an engine, already carrying a flaw nobody outside Ford knew about, 300 horsepower is screaming through a rocker shaft system running on nothing but a razor-thin film of oil. One bad passage, one moment of starvation up top, and this entire run ends in seized metal, not a record. It doesn't happen, not today. The car crosses the line, and the numbers that come back don't just beat the competition. They rewrite what people thought a mass-produced Ford engine was capable of. Nobody watching that sand fly knew how close this engine was running to its own hidden edge. Off the track, the story was the same. In 1954 and again in 1957, Ford outsold Chevrolet, the exact rival this engine had been rushed into existence to beat. Showrooms couldn't move. Y-block powered Fords fast enough, and more cars sold meant more of these engines out on American roads, every single day, sitting in driveways from coast to coast. Somewhere at Ford, the people closest to that oiling design had to be watching those sales numbers with a very different feeling than everyone else in the building. Every new Y block sold wasn't just a win. It was another one of these engines out in the world, running on whatever oil its owner could afford, on whatever schedule its owner kept. That should have been the end of the story. Underdog builds a legend, underdog wins. But that's exactly when two separate problems, both buried inside this same engine, started closing in from opposite directions. The first was the one already ticking. More engines on the road meant more short trips, more neglected oil changes, more sludge building up in a passage that had almost no room to spare. At first, it was just a handful of complaints, scattered and easy to dismiss. A strange ticking sound here, a rough idle there, the kind of thing any mechanic could blame on bad luck or a careless owner who skipped an oil change. But the more Fords Ford sold, the more that sound started showing up. In service bays across the country, mechanics began hearing the exact same thing over and over in engines that had no business failing this early. A faint metallic tick buried under the idle, right where the valve covers met the head. Small, almost nothing, easy to miss if you weren't already listening for it. A service bay late in the day, the overhead lights buzzing, everyone else gone home. A mechanic leans in over an open hood, one hand braced on the fender, listening. There it is again. He's heard this exact sound before, more than once, and every time it's meant the same thing is happening again, quietly, inside an engine that still looks and sounds perfectly fine to everyone else. He doesn't have a name for it yet. Ford hasn't given him one. No manual on his shelf explains it. But he knows what happens if he ignores it. That tick doesn't stay a tick. It turns into a knock. The knock turns into metal, grinding on metal with nothing left to protect it. And somewhere down the line, on some empty stretch of road, an owner ends up stranded with a rocker shaft that welded itself solid from the inside out. It's happened enough times by now that mechanics across the country recognize the pattern the moment they hear it. A car that drove fine for months, then died without warning, far from a service bay. No single documented case defines this story. The pattern itself is the evidence, repeated in garage after garage, year after year. There was no sweeping recall, no public admission that the oiling system itself was the problem. Instead, external oil line fixes began circulating among mechanics, parts suppliers, and Y-block builders, bypassing the choked passage completely, treated by those who used it like routine maintenance instead of what it actually was. For the mechanics doing the actual work, none of it felt routine. Every week, another Y-block would roll in with the same complaint. Another owner standing there, arms crossed, asking why an engine this new, this celebrated, this covered in trophies, was already falling apart under the hood. Mechanics were the ones left explaining a problem the company that built the engine refused to name out loud, patching cars by hand with an aftermarket fix that had begun circulating outside any official channel. And a fix that has to stay hidden never stays hidden for long. Owners started talking to each other. A driver in one town would hear that ticking sound, take his car in, and walk out with a strange little copper line running along the outside of his engine that hadn't been there when he bought the car. He'd mention it at a local track. Another owner would ask what it was, then go home and check his own engine and find the exact same thing already starting. Word moved faster than Ford could ever control. At diners near the racetracks, at gas stations, at Sunday car shows where owners popped their hoods to compare notes, the same question kept coming up. Does yours tick yet? Not if, when. By the late 1950s, hot rodders and drag racers, the same people pushing these engines harder than any factory ever intended, had turned the external oil line into common knowledge. Speed shops started stocking the parts. Magazines aimed at engine builders started printing instructions for a fix that had become common knowledge among people who worked on these engines every day. Think about what that actually means. An entire underground fix, kept alive for years, built around a flaw the company that made the engine never fully admitted was there. While that first problem was quietly spreading through speed shops and service bays, the second problem was closing in from an entirely different direction, and this one had nothing to do with oil. The same deep-skirted block that made the Y block strong enough to survive NASCAR punishment had also locked its bore spacing in place from day one, back when nobody at Ford imagined this engine would ever need to grow much bigger than it already was. By the late 1950s, that decision came back to haunt them too. Chevrolet's small block wasn't just competitive anymore. It had been built with room to grow, and grow it did. Climbing toward displacements, the Y block's architecture had no path to reach. Chrysler wasn't standing still either, pushing bigger, heavier-hitting engines of its own into the horsepower war. Ford needed more size, more cubic inches, fast, in a fight where displacement was starting to decide who survived. And this is where the Y block hit a wall. Engineers could bore the cylinders out slightly, they could stroke the crank a little further. But the block itself, the exact same design that had made this engine strong enough to win 2 championships, had nowhere left to expand. By 1957, at 312 cubic inches, the architecture was already becoming increasingly difficult to enlarge economically. Pushing much further would mean starting over completely. So picture Ford's position at the end of the decade. An engine that couldn't grow any bigger. The same engine already known, quietly, across garages and speed shops, for a reliability weakness Ford had never publicly explained. Neither problem alone would have ended this engine's story. A size limit is survivable if your reputation is spotless. A reliability question is survivable if you still have room to grow past it and let a bigger, more powerful successor speak for itself. The Y block had neither escape. It was boxed in from both sides at exactly the same time. The reputation that had taken years to build was unraveling in months. People who once lined up to buy this engine started asking dealers a very different question. Has this been fixed yet? Some walked away entirely, choosing the exact rival this engine had been built from the ground up to beat. The narrow margin for error built into this engine years earlier, back under a deadline nobody could move, was now doing what no competitor on any track had ever managed. It was beating Ford from the inside. Sales that once climbed now stalled. Trust that once seemed unbreakable was gone, replaced by whispers in service bays and speed shops about an engine nobody could quite say was safe. And Ford was left holding a champion it could no longer sell the way it used to, and couldn't fully vouch for either. Inside Ford, the pressure had shifted. The same urgency that once demanded speed now demanded a way out, and a full fix meant redesigning the head entirely on top of solving the size limit at the same time. That wasn't a patch anymore. It was a new engine. There was only one move left. By 1958, Ford introduced a new engine family, the FE, a larger displacement design built for the next stage of the horsepower war, with a thin wall block casting that finally gave it room to grow. The Y block didn't vanish overnight. It kept powering Ford's smaller cars and light trucks for years afterward, hanging on in the lineup while the FE quietly took over the role it once held. By 1962, Ford's full-size passenger cars had moved on to the new Windsor small block. By 1964, Y block production for American cars was effectively over. Its place at the center of Ford's performance strategy had already been taken away, years before the last one rolled off the line. An engine that had beaten every rival in America on the track and outsold them in the showroom was quietly retired from the country that built it, just 10 years after it arrived, promising to change everything. Here's the part that still doesn't sit right with people who know this engine's full history. Overseas, in Argentina and Brazil, modified versions of the Y block kept running for decades, right into the 1980s, which means the core design wasn't fundamentally broken. It survived. Just not here, not in the country that built it, raced it, and eventually walked away from it. Nobody, not Ford, not the engineers, not the historians who've spent decades pulling these blocks apart, has ever put an exact number on how many Y blocks failed, specifically because of this passage, compared to engines that simply wore out the way any old engine eventually does. Ford never released that data. Maybe it never fully tracked it, or maybe it did, and simply chose never to let anyone outside the company see it. Either way, the silence itself has become part of the story. What survives instead is decades of mechanics' notes, owner reports, and a well-known fix that wouldn't exist if the problem behind it wasn't real. What we do know is this: Ford built an engine strong enough to humble every rival in America for 2 straight years. And the same engine carried from the very beginning a narrow margin for error tucked inside a channel most owners never even knew existed. So was that tiny flaw really what killed the Y block? Not by itself. The oiling weakness didn't finish this engine on its own. It did something quieter, and in some ways more damaging. It gave the Y block a reputation it never completely escaped, right when Ford needed that reputation most, right as the size limit closed in from the other direction with nowhere left to grow. A healthy, trusted engine might have survived the ceiling by leaning on its name a little longer. This engine didn't have that cushion left. No boardroom villain, no sabotage, just a narrow passage, a hard limit on how big this architecture could ever get, and a company that chose to walk away rather than fight both battles at once. Somewhere out there right now, an old Y block is sitting in a garage, and its owner has no idea whether that copper line was ever installed. Turn the key and it will still start, still idle smooth, still sound exactly like it did the day it left the factory. The countdown clock built into this engine 70 years ago hasn't stopped. It's just waiting. It's always just been waiting. If this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe now. And if you know an engine with a secret like this one, tell us in the comments. We're already looking for the next one to take apart.